Okay, and I will hit record. All right, I think we are. I think we're set. Oh, give me just a second here. I gotta. Oh, interesting.
Hmm.
All right. I think we should be good to go.
Okay.
Um, all right, Josh. Welcome to our first sort of educational stream. Up to this point, we've been mostly going through like my life and perspective, and today we're going to talk about freedom. Well, the title of this one is Liberty. Subtitle Freedom and Autonomy. And the goal for today is to dig into a question, right? Which is, how does a government reinforce the rights of its people? Um, I want to start off by saying, I'm not an expert in really anything that we're going to talk about today. There are many people who are much more knowledgeable on subjects like this that I welcome, correction from. The goal of today is really just to break up a bit of the nuance surrounding this concept of freedom, right? Um, I think that the idea of freedom has, to some degree, been, I don't know, misconstrued, right? When we talk about freedom, sometimes people think that means the ability to do whatever I want. Um, and so let me real quick just go through the agenda here, and then we'll get into the definition that I operate on for what freedom is. We'll also talk to some degree about the role of government and all of that, and then dive into perspectives. Cool with you?
Yeah, I'm excited to learn.
Awesome. All right, let's just look real quickly at the agenda. So we're going to go through some key terms, and then we're going to jump into perspective. I want to go through some of the people throughout history that have had, a prominent voice about this concept of freedom. Explore a little bit of their perspective on the role of government, and then also, do a little review of their historical context. And then I want to talk about the United States and the ways, or the people rather, that influenced our, structure, the facets of the United States government. And then we'll close out today with talking a little bit about Cowlitz County and some of the discussions that are happening today related to this idea of freedom and autonomy. Um, let's start with a few definitions. So these are very basic, right? And of course, there's entire books that have been written on on subjects like these. But freedom, in this context, we say is the right to act, speak, or think as one wants. Now, it's interesting to me to have a word like think in there because, of course, we can think how we want. But I feel as though the expression of those thoughts is really what's buried under that word, right? It's not just about what I have going on in my head. It's also about my ability to articulate that in, you might call it like the public square, in open dialogue, right?
Yeah.
There's a couple different kinds of freedom. What we call personal freedom, which is the ability to make choices about your own life and body. Political freedom, which is the right to participate in political process, and that includes the right to vote, to express your political viewpoints, and to form parties, right? Um, and the last is economic freedom. So that's the ability to participate in commerce, engaging in business activity. All of these things we're generally operating on the assumption that we're trying not to have a bunch of interference
Mm-hmm.
into
Yeah.
those things, right?
Yep.
Um, real quick, I want to pinpoint something on the idea of forming parties.
Yeah.
I know we've talked in the past, Josh, about partisan politics, and the challenges therein, and how frustrating it can be to feel like we have to slot into particular groups. So real quick, I wanted to just talk about Madison's perspective on that.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, uh, you know, uh, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison wrote a series of essays that are called the Federalist Papers. These were, I believe, 88 documents. I can't quite remember right now. Yeah, in which they just basically defended the idea that we should become a unified nation, that we shouldn't be, 4 separate nations or 13 separate colonies, things like that. And in letter number 10, which Madison wrote, he talked about factions. Now, we'd understand factions today as parties, right?
Yeah.
And just, I wanted to give this little statement that Madison gave, because he was talking about how you might eliminate the idea of factions and its relationship with freedom. I loved this quote. He said, "Freedom is to factions what oxygen is to fire. It would be equally silly to try to eliminate freedom as a way of addressing the problem of factions as it would be to try to eliminate oxygen as a way of quelling fire." Right? So the idea that we can express ourselves freely, that we can do that without interference, it is naturally what leads to us splitting up into various groups. It's not good or bad, in my opinion, right? It's just the natural kind of outpouring of being in society and finding people who think the way that you think and aligning on a particular goal and realizing that there are other people who do not have that same goal and unifying, right? Madison said the other way that you could try to eliminate this is you could make everybody think the same thing. Good luck. so, so that's freedom. Any questions on that? We'll move quickly through the other two here, but
no.
Cool.
No, I think that was helpful for sure.
Awesome. So control in this context, right? We're talking about the mechanisms by which the government manages things. So laws and policies that the government or authority directs or regulates society, right? When we talk about government control, we're talking about some kind of rules, some structures that are put on top of our ability to move freely within them. And then rights in this context are interesting because rights are kind of a subcategory of freedoms, right? Generally speaking, we think about these as things that are guaranteed to us, right? So, we have in the United States Constitution this set of rules that we call the Bill of Rights.
Yep.
And as we go forward a little bit here, we might talk a little bit more about that. Interestingly enough, Alexander Hamilton argued directly against the idea of a Bill of Rights. We'd had ones like this. There were like the Magna Carta, for example. And Hamilton argued that if we tried to enumerate these, if we tried to list them out, it would invite a lot of debate over what exactly they mean. He said one of the ones we're talking about right now is freedom of the press. First of all, what is freedom and what is the press? Right? So, there's not always even been a firm understanding of what rights are and of how you best enforce those. Generally speaking, we talk about natural rights, which are things people are born with. They can't be taken away. Civil rights, which are the ones that are guaranteed to us to ensure freedom and equality of individuals in law. And then human rights, right, which we might think of as not something that you are personally born with, but that we naturally have rights to, right? The right to life. I think we might talk about the pursuit of happiness and things like that, although I don't know that that's quite codified in the same way. So that's freedom, control, and rights. And next, what I want to do is jump into a few different perspectives. I want to talk about some people throughout history and the various ideas that they've held on these concepts. Before I do, Josh, anything you feel like is worth diving into here or that you want to dissect a little bit more?
No, I think as we kind of relate it back to the various folks that we're going to discuss throughout today, I think I'll have some more questions.
Cool. All right, so let's talk about Socrates. Socrates was a philosopher in ancient Greece. Little fun fact: we don't have first person writings or thoughts from Socrates. Pretty much everything we know about this guy came from a disciple of his called Plato. There is some debate over whether Socrates even existed, which is interesting, just because, again, because there aren't these like first person accounts. Plato wrote a lot about this guy Socrates and about, their discussions. The allegory of the cave was, as far as I remember, a discussion between him and Socrates. But anyways, so the ideas that Socrates held to, I'll talk about him as if he's a real person, for today, right? Yeah. The first is his perspective on freedom. So Socrates is quoted as saying, "An unexamined life is not worth living." He felt as though the outpouring of one's individual freedom comes through self-examination. So, we should be reflecting on ourselves. We should be thinking about who we are and how we are, and we should be trying to apply, morals and ethics to the decisions that we make. Naturally, he believed that the government's role in a society is to encourage people to live a fair and ethical life, to think about, right, how they live in the world. He really championed this idea of freedom of thought. Now, with that in mind, there was some interesting historical context for him, because he observed Athens as a direct democracy. Direct democracy is a little different than we think about democracy today. Direct democracy, we're talking about, quite literally, open discussion. Now, it wasn't as open as we might think about today, because it was very much male public officials, things like that. So, it was not as open to, the voice of like slaves and women, for example. But the idea was, and the operation was, that pretty much anybody could come into these public discussions and, freely debate. Even their approach in Athens to elected officials was different than we have today. They call it drawing lots. They essentially picked people at random from the citizenry and said, "Hey, you're in charge now. Like, here you go. Here's your responsibility for a little while." With that, Socrates also saw a mess. Very difficult management process of dealing with people and all of their various opinions. And, he saw the challenges of allowing people to self-govern, to the point where, he started to get, I think, a little bit more defensive of, even a representative system. Now, that wasn't exactly fitting for the time. Ancient Athens was not really there. But by the time we got to Aristotle, the guy we'll talk about next, we had now had some examples of representative systems and a little bit more kind of governing rule. Any questions on this one here before we move to Aristotle?
No, I'm glad that you kind of rounded out with that at the end, because I was curious. I mean, it's very interesting way to approach it, but it goes back. It's like, hey, what are ethics? What are morals? And like they vary so drastically from person to person. So it's interesting to understand how Socrates started to see some of that messiness, and I'm curious to see how it started to round it.
Right. Yeah, and I think this idea of this electing random citizens is, I think, it's pretty attractive in the modern view, because it's like, well, yeah, I mean, we have these like hard fought political battles at this point, and they end up being, to some degree, popularity contests. And so, yeah, it would be nice if like random people were pulled out. I think as we'll get further on, we'll start to see the reasons why folks started to go towards a more organized system, a little less random. So let's move to Aristotle here. Yeah. So, Aristotle, Aristotle was alive at a time when the There was a lot of monarchy. He was around during the like Macedonian Empire and Alexander the Great and things like that. Um, but he felt as though the way that we are free is, and this is a very, by the way, a very like narrow view into Aristotle's perspective, but that freedom comes from being governed. That when we have a body over top of us that is trying to regulate things, is trying to manage things, that's when we find a real kind of freedom. He didn't really like the idea that we would just kind of mosey around and not have any structure. And he felt like what the government should be trying to do is supporting society's flourishing. There's this word, eudaimonia. He felt that if there's going to be a government, as he felt there should be, he was a defender of the concept of governance, that government should be focused on creating a good life for its people, helping them to live good lives and providing the structure for which they could live good lives. Now, again, that was mostly influenced by seeing the Macedonian rule and the flourishing that resulted from that rule by somebody like Alexander the Great. On top of that, right, by that point, the societies of Athens, the direct democracies and things like that had some time to kind of show up and show results. And he saw lots of examples where allowing the people to rule themselves, to self-govern, seemed like it created a lot of problems, seemed like it created a lot of mess. Now, it's tough for me to say whether or not he was a defender of the idea of a monarchy, over top of groups. But at the very least, he felt there was some value in governance and felt like that's how we find our freedom as people, is in being governed. Any questions on that?
No.
Cool.
No.
All right. Yeah, he was also, by the way, pretty heavily influenced by Plato. And he was an advocate for the sort of constitutional republic model, the system that allows for representatives of individuals. I think he felt that if there was going to be a monarchy, we should also probably have people who are speaking to that monarchy directly, and that we shouldn't pull from the citizens themselves to ask them to come and speak to these higher powers. We'll move next then into John Locke. So John Locke is a pretty big name in the history of freedom and debate. John Locke believed that we have an innate right to life, liberty, and property. Now, he felt that those rights were easy and natural to argue through reason and logic. And this is kind of like fundamentally how John Locke operated. Is he was like, all of our ideas should spring out of reasoning and rationale. And so he felt like the government's role was really just to be protectors of those natural rights, of those rights, derived through reason. He didn't want the government to kind of come in over top and put a lot of unnecessary restrictions on top of us, as much as he felt that the government's job was just to make sure that we had those fundamental rights. Now, property is, I think, important here, because we're not just talking at this point about the ability to own things. We're also kind of extending out to owning the fruits of your labor, right? Like if you go in and produce something, you should be able to hold on to the value of whatever goods or services you produce. And so it's a little broader than just my freedom to own things, and more about my ability to produce, to put things forward, and get return on those things, right? Now, his context was the British monarchy, and the disconnects between the monarchy at that time and the parliamentary system that was being developed in Britain. At the time we had monarchical rule, we had kings, And at the same time, we had legislatures, right? We had different houses and representatives of different communities. And, he felt that there was, at least it seems like, he felt like there was a struggle happening between those two styles of governance. Um, and that we were shifting away from the concepts of this, the divine right of kings. Divine right of kings, again, for anyone who's not super familiar, is this idea that like people who are kings are there because God made them so, and that if they are a king, we should assume that that's because God wants them to be the king, and that means that we need to listen to them and we
Right.
need to follow them, right?
Yeah.
Locke, I think, started to see the cracks in that particular way of assessing the value of leaders. Um, Thoughts there, Josh?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it kind of, well, it ties back, right? I think it starts to, I mean, it shows how complicated this stuff really is,
Mm-hmm.
to sum it up, right? Because in the beginning, we kind of, I think one of the attractive points of just pulling people at random and saying, hey, here's a public position, here's your responsibility, is that they also have boots on the ground, right? Like they're
Right.
close to the common man and common person, and they have that perspective. And I think that's where we started getting away from at some point too. And now John Locke is starting to see that those cracks in some of the ways that we've shaped and shifted. So it's also interesting just to see how it ebbs and flows and kind of is a cycle, right? In some
Yeah.
ways, not always, but it is.
Well, and what's interesting too about this is there's a big gap of time, right, between people like Aristotle and John Locke. For a long time in history, we did not have open discussion really. Um, there now keeping in mind, right, most of the people that we're going to go through today, let's just talk a little bit about those individuals. We're talking mostly Western, European, primarily white voices, men. These were the people who had the platforms to speak on these subjects. And there were a lot of other voices in and around this time that were not particularly championed, right? So it's worth noting that when we talk about like what discussions were going on, a lot of it has to do with what was written down and the people who were given that stage. But yeah, I mean, for a long, long time in human history, we had, the when we had government, when we had governance structures, we had kings.
Yeah.
We had a feudal system that primarily, was like little kingdoms all around. You had lords, and then you had indentured servants or slaves that were serving those particular people. These thinkers were sometimes almost going against the grain to even want to discuss the merits of particular systems. Wouldn't it be so much easier for kings if nobody ever questioned their kingship? Right? Um,
Yeah.
and for what it's worth, these voices in particular are, of course, not the only voices, but we also should acknowledge that lots of people had violence enacted on them, right, as a result of their speaking out. I think in my reading and study, there has always been some dissenting voice saying, "Hey, maybe this isn't the way things should be," right?
Mm.
And I think that is kind of what you were getting at, in just that, hey,
Yeah.
there's just this complexity. There's always
Yeah.
some discussion going on about whether or not the way we're doing things right now is the right thing, is the best thing. A few people we'll talk about a little bit later here too actually speak on that specific idea that we do have this open discussion, and that discussion is fundamental to freedom for us. Um, cool. Sorry, not to ramble too much more on there,
No,
but any
I
other
love it.
thoughts on
I
that?
love it. Then no, I that was perfect context.
Awesome.
I really
Okay,
appreciate
so let's talk then about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This is the second of three Johns we're going to talk about. Jean-Jacques Rousseau um, was primarily arguing that freedom, he thought, comes from building a government system for yourself. And in my slides here, I have it: participation in and creation of your own government. Um, you know, like like Aristotle, he defended the idea that there should be a governing system for all of us, but that the way that we get there is really important. And that specifically when we're talking about, your individual freedom, he felt it should come from you having a say in how things work for you. He argued that government. I don't want to be too simplistic here, but it might be fair to say that government should be nothing more than an expression of the will of its people, and that if the people want something, in a particular way, the government should be constructed to reflect that. Now he's kind of arguing that the goal of government is to produce some kind of common good, right? That it's just about making people's lives better. And the historical context for Jean-Jacques Rousseau is really important here, right? He was there at the time of the Enlightenment, when these ideas of reason and science, and inquiry and questioning things were really prominent. And he saw an incredible amount of inequality in France. This was a time in which monarchical rulers were being acted out upon, to put it politely. And he saw just this incredible amount of inequality that came from that sort of centralization of power and wealth, right? Economic and social inequality, the divide between rich and poor was very apparent. Wealth and privilege concentrated into the hands of a few people, and a tremendous amount of disenfranchisement. Taking away of people's individual ability to participate in the system, almost to the point where people didn't feel they could speak up, right? The political systems as well focused mostly on the wealthy, and listening to what wealthy people wanted. We have lots and lots of stories throughout history of, French aristocrats, right, and various statements about, I don't know. Ooh, little digression. Josh, do you remember the story of Marie Antoinette? Do you remember the story of Marie Antoinette saying, "Let them eat cake"?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's your context for that story, as you have it?
I just always remember. What is the context there? I mean, I just always remember my grandma always talking about it for some reason. I don't know why. As a young kid. But I do know, I know that it was just about like, it was during the a famine in France, right? Obviously, and going back to your point, where the rich weren't really dealing with the famine, they were whatever. And my take is that Marie Antoinette's take on it was whatever, let them eat cake, right? Or,
yeah, well, and here's how the story kind of goes, right? French peasants were starting to revolt, and went to the I forget exactly where it was, but went to the place where the wealthy were, and complained, we don't even have enough flour to make bread. And as the story goes, a soldier communicated that message to Marie Antoinette, and she said, "Oh, well, just let them eat cake," right? Funny enough, this is not quite so much of a digression, because this is actually traced back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to a bit of writing, something called Confessions in 1765. But what's funny about this is it's apocryphal. It's not true, as far as we know. It does not seem as though Marie Antoinette ever said this particular phrase. Best I remember from little bit of historical study I've done, it's most likely this was repeated to the peasants by a soldier and attributed to Marie Antoinette, despite her not having said anything like that. The idea of that story, though, right, is I think just the funny part of it is, if their complaint was not having enough flour to make bread, and cake was the substitution. Cake takes more flour than bread does, and so that was not really a solution to the problem. This story has been told as a way of demonstrating how out of touch the aristocrats in France were at the time. But so Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right, was there during the time of and just before the French Revolution. And so his perspective on governance, and the rights of people were informed in part by seeing just how much inequality there was, and very very shortly after all of this writing and thinking, we had the French Revolution. We had uh, beheadings and the guillotine and the usurp of power and authority in that particular way. Um, Now, following people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, there were other more, I guess, like temperate voices, maybe softer perspectives that came. Rousseau, I don't believe was particularly an advocate for violence, um, but we did have people who argued a similar perspective. One in particular, his name's John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill wrote this. I'm moving into my next slide here. John Stuart Mill wrote an essay called "On Liberty," and it was a marked defense against what he called the tyranny of the majority. Um, John Stuart Mill was very concerned about people's ability to speak out in opposition to ideas they disagreed with. One statement I remember from my reading was, he said, if every single person holds a particular idea except one, he said, that group is of no greater ability to suppress that one person's thinking than that one person is to suppress all of their thinking. He really felt there was an incredible amount of value in eccentricity.
Yeah.
That it was worthwhile to allow people who had ideas that we might perceive as crazy. Um, and so his perspective on freedom was very broad. He essentially said that as long as we aren't causing harm to other people, we should be allowed to do whatever we want, and that the role of government is to step in only in cases when somebody's decisions and choices appear to be leading to harm for another person. Now, he struggled at the time to really define harm, but there were a couple of different categories, right? There was like physical harm, psychological harm, which is like causing fear, distress, suffering to another person, economic or material harm, so damaging to somebody's property or their ability to produce, for themselves, and violation of rights was another, taking away people's ability to, quote, pursue their own good in their own way. And then social harm to a community's sense of cohesion, trust with one another. So, all these different areas he felt were areas in which a government should be able to step in if somebody is having some kind of impact. And he didn't advocate, I think, for a particular kind of intervention. I think, as far as I remember, it was just him saying, well, we should, at that point, talk about it. We should talk about what to do about it. When we see those things, it's our job to start to discuss that and come up with a plan for how we deal with it. His context, too, was during the Industrial Revolution. He was starting to see all of this development, and starting to see the government begin to grow in power and authority, I think, as things got more complicated, right? We started to see massive technological development. We started seeing maybe even a little bit more disparity and inequality as a result of these changes. And he saw the risks, perhaps, of a government that was willing to step in situations that he felt they shouldn't. So that was, I think, he probably, of all the people we're talking about today, he probably took the most like libertarian view of this, that we should be allowed to do what we want except in cases where we cause harm to individuals. I'll stop there because I've just talked for a little while. Any thoughts or questions there, Josh?
No, it's interesting. John Stuart Mill is not. I mean, most of these names up until this point, like, I didn't know a lot about, but I'm familiar with them.
Sure.
Right? John Stuart Mill is somebody I'm not. it's interesting to see somebody back then take it to that end of an extreme, but it also makes a lot of sense
Yeah,
from what how government has progressed throughout the years. So
yeah,
um,
and for what it's worth, right? Like, I on a personal level, reading through John Stuart Mill and through his perspective, it's close to mine.
mm-hmm.
Um, I think where and I think where I one second here. Oop. I think where I like disconnect, from John Stuart Mill is in his utilitarian views. So utilitarianism is I'm gonna butcher this definition here. Utilitarianism is like generally the idea that we can objectively assess the value of right and wrong and of good and bad decisions. John Stuart Mill was heavily influenced by a mentor of his, Jeremy Brentford, I think was the name. Let me look that up while I'm talking. Um, Jeremy Bentham, that was right. Jeremy
Okay.
Bentham came up with a numerical system for assessing the good and bad decisions. And John Stuart Mill later on in his life tried to align utilitarianism with this concept
Mm-hmm.
of freedom. He argued that the the thing we should be after is pursuit of individual pleasure, and to try our best to avoid individual pain, right? No, pleasure is not. We're not thinking specifically just about like kind of base desires here, but it's like good things in our lives, right? Like
Yeah.
success, happiness, safety, security,
Yeah.
things like that are all kind of encompassing in that pleasure pain dichotomy. But utilitarianism has been criticized. Um, it's been referred to as a pig ideology. Um,
Huh.
what one argument made against it is, hey, if you try to math out, what actions cause pleasure and don't cause pain or avoid pain and suffering, well, that moral system would suggest that the objectively best way for all of us to live is to sit around all day eating chocolate cake because it helps us and doesn't hurt anyone, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I think it was a little more nuanced than that. I think that
Right.
there was some open discussion about how literal you would take a system that tried to evaluate right and wrong in those ways. But but generally speaking, John Stuart Mill felt that the government's intervention should just be in cases where we saw harm being caused, and that otherwise we should let people be. He was very, very worried that that tyranny of the majority thread was all throughout his writing and thinking. The idea that we could justify, suppressing an individual's ability, he felt was such an abject risk. The inability to speak out against individuals, sorry, the inability to speak out against particular ideas, he felt was so risky. We would fall off a cliff and just do what most people thought was right.
Yeah.
Um, I really liked his defense of eccentricity. you know, kind of that it's like, hey, it's okay that we have a few people who sound crazy, who sound so different from the rest of us. That's better than us trying to restrict that thinking and prevent them from being able to speak. What if they say something that we think is wrong and we suppress it, and then it turns out much later we evaluate that again and say actually they were right. You know.
Yeah.
Um, what do you think about that, Josh? What's your observation there?
Oh man, I mean, I would agree that I think from the very high level conversation that we have today, like I align pretty closely with John Stewart. I think where I lose him to is the utilitarianism,
Mm,
right? Like I just think I get the idea of it, but to that point, right? Like I understand why it's called like the the pig, and we would all just be eating chocolate cake. But I do think that there is some like good that can come from that, and like that train of thinking, and not just as black and white as okay 0 to 10, but like
Right.
how can we break that scale out and make it a little bit more complex and a little bit more
Yeah.
granular where we find that common ground. So
There was another pretty interesting analogy I felt like gave a little room to the nuance of this, right? Um, it was this story. I'm going to try my best to tell it as I remember it. Um, somebody goes to heaven, and they're talking about being sent back down to earth, or maybe it's a soul that is about to be sent down from heaven by God, and they're given a choice. You can either be Handel, the famous composer, or you can be an oyster, and that 10 times out of 10 when people were asked this question, they go, well, I want to be the famous composer, right? And that exposing a little bit of the faults in this utilitarian idea, because if you did the math, an oyster has that, like, those soft pleasures, right? Like, feeling the ocean current and the warmth of the sun, right? And being able to eat, and it's just it's this very, like, nice pleasurable thing, versus a famous composer who gets all of this notoriety, and gets to create and be creative. And people said, well, it's obvious, you'd pick being the famous composer. John Stuart Mill, I think, reflected on that and said, yeah, it makes sense that would be the case, right? It's obviously more complicated than just good with the absence of bad, because we want that pursuit of of those higher pleasures, right? It's for us individually. I think, but I do my best not to misrepresent somebody like this here. But for us individually, I think he thought that we recognize that it is more complicated than just ones and zeros and black and white and the ability to math things out. But I do think, like you just said, he defended the idea that we should be trying to assess our decisions in some way objectively, right? If we just leave it all up to what we feel like in the moment, they're without thinking about things. Maybe even we pull back to Socrates here, right? Without that self-examination, we might miss stuff. We might not think of things in the best way. And I think for John Stuart Mill, his concern was really avoiding that suffering, avoiding harm to individuals. He struggled, right, with defining what harm is, and major critics of him pointed out some of those inconsistencies in his thinking. But I do feel as though that kind of thinking, to me, is very attractive, right? And it was I think kind of this progression that we're showing through these different thinkers, this idea of thinking at a higher level about how things should be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool. So from here we're gonna jump forward a little bit in time. We're gonna circle back to the United States and the kind of thinking that was happening at the time. But John Stuart Mill was operating around the same time as the United States was developing its idea of independence and freedom. To move just a little bit forward here, I want to talk about Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass was a staunch abolitionist, right?
Yep.
He saw the United States, specifically American society, based around slavery, and he felt as though the disservice that was done to people who were subject to slavery was that their right to be free was taken away. He saw slavery as a grave moral and political evil, right? And that freedom is the ability to self-improve, to think freely, to be treated as an equal. So with that in mind, he felt the government's responsibility was to both protect rights, like Locke and Mill both suggested, but also to promote social equality and to encourage democracy. And democracy, by the way, in this context, we're talking about like the voice of the people, the ability for individuals to speak up. We're not specifically talking about like a democratic system, as much as he felt it was the government's job to support the people in their ability to speak, right? And to think freely and act freely and be treated with equality. He argued for moral and intellectual freedom and the value of education in all of that. That a well-educated people is better suited, to support their own self-development and self-improvement, right? And so the government's job is to protect those rights and to promote individual ability, really to make us equal, right? Now, again, his context was he was there, during the Civil War discussions and the Reconstruction era, right? So immediately following the Civil War, we had a period in which we were thinking about how we want to build up a nation that is not fundamentally based around having a slave class. And we didn't get all the way through all of those challenges by the time Frederick Douglass died. I would argue we still are dealing with a lot of the fallouts of those decisions and the problems that are associated with slavery. But the conversation at the time was like, well, how do we make people's lives better? How do we allow them to self-improve?
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm just looking at my notes here for Douglass. I think that the last example we have here, I want to move forward in that. But any thoughts on Douglass or any of this thinking? You can kind of see the progression, right?
Yeah,
like
100%.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think what's interesting about somebody like Frederick Douglass is, he wasn't saying anything. I don't think he was saying anything particularly radical, given what we've talked about up to this point. Yeah. I think the disconnect he was pointing out is like, hey, you guys have been thinking so long about freedom, and like your freedom has not included a very big chunk of people who he should be entitled to that same kind of freedom, right? If we're going to have all these conversations about innate rights, and natural rights that spring out from being an individual, well, shouldn't that apply to everybody? And that makes a lot of sense to me, and especially it makes sense to me why he would have defended that particular perspective in his context, right? He saw, man, he had some very detailed descriptions of the horrors that came from being a slave, and again, this is to kind of pull back a little bit. This is to talk about what harm you allow if you allow one person to control another person and to have dominion over them, right? His defense of government here is interesting to try to compare, because he'd actually say, well, no, like it's the individual influencing another individual that is a problem. And the job of that structure of government, right, is to think at a higher level than that, is to think higher than just an individual. He felt that the government as a body should be pushing for a broader sense of equality, that it's not the job of individuals, and that if we put it into the hands of individuals, we get all of this harm as a result, right? Slavery up to this point was individuals making decisions about who to subjugate, and for every story there might be about maybe a plantation owner or slave owner who like didn't beat and kill his slaves, there were many, many more of people who were incredibly cruel and violent, right? And Douglass saw that and documented that, and I think felt that it was the responsibility of the government to step in on their behalf and say, hey, stop it, right? Stop doing that. That's not okay. That idea of extending equality out to every person who should have it is really, I think, where like the thread of Douglass kind of followed.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Cool. And then the last example we have here, which is considerably more modern, is Mahatma Gandhi, right? So Gandhi was an interesting figure in history because he was observing the harms of imperialist Britain in India, right? And like Douglass, like Rousseau, he also saw an incredible amount of inequality. he felt that, freedom for individuals comes from our ability to control our own impulses and desires. He advocated for a moral and ethical system that also integrated spirituality. Um, he held a perspective of nonviolence.
Yeah.
And what he wanted was a government that focused on supporting the welfare of its people. Otherwise, it seems, he advocated that we should be able to self-govern, that we should be able to make our own decisions. The idea that a knowing you know a knowing body of people coming in over top of his people and saying, here's how you should do things, right? I think he saw the natural progression of that, and all of the pain and suffering that individuals felt as a result of being subjugated. And so he argued for self-governance, right? Decentralization is another word for this. Mm-hmm. That we would, I just realized I don't have my slide back up here. He argued for self-governance, that we should decentralize, that there shouldn't be, this big body kind of looking at over top of us, and that if the government exists at all, it does so specifically to support the welfare of its people. He saw that inequality. He saw the perception that British imperial rule had in India, and felt that we would be better off if we did not, allow this level of control. Instead, just choosing to support individuals. Now, here I want to talk a little bit, and I haven't talked up to this point about the values of people, but I do want to talk a little bit about Gandhi, because I want to be sensitive to the fact that there is, some, him being a modern figure, there's some controversy here, right? I'm not in any way saying that Gandhi was somehow a paragon of virtue or values. In fact, there's pretty good evidence that he had his own impulses and desires, to put it politely, specifically his interactions with children that were harmful. Yeah. And so I don't mean to highlight Mahatma Gandhi as a figure to be necessarily admired, but his ideas, again, were much like what we've seen before, something of a reaction, right, to the inequality he saw, and to the I think the vacuum of non-spiritualism that British imperial government sort of forced. India historically has been very religious, and continues to be to this day a very religious nation. And he advocated that it would be better off if we tried to integrate some of that spirituality into our thinking and decision making. But anyways, any thoughts or observations on that, Josh?
No, I think it's a really good call out. And I appreciate you going through all of this context, and you're right. It's very interesting to see how it progresses, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's always a byproduct of an individual's experience and what they're going through at that point in time, right? With Frederick Douglass, with Jean-Jacques, all of that. So
absolutely, yeah. I mean, we had so let's recap, right? So we had Socrates, yep, reacting to the challenges of direct democracy, and arguing that the government's job is to encourage people to live a moral and ethical life. We had Aristotle, who saw the value of monarchical rule in supporting the flourishing of society, and the challenges that came with more democratic ways of doing things. We had Locke, who saw a parliamentary system in conflict with a monarchy, and who focused primarily on supporting and defending the rights of individuals. And then we had Rousseau, who saw massive amounts of inequality in the French aristocracy, and felt that the job of the government should be instead to think about and to be a natural expression of the will of the people. We then had Mill, who said that, as the government's power was growing, we should be thinking about and evaluating the power of government, right? And that we should be doing our best to try to limit it so that we're given the ability to express ourselves freely, right? And that the government should only step in cases where there was harm to be caused. We had Douglas, who saw a similar kind of inequality, except there was a particular group of people who were subject to an inequality that everyone else seemed to have. And so his defense of equality as the principal role of government, that it should be to support individuals in that self-improvement, right? And then lastly, we had Gandhi, who again saw inequality as a result of that British imperial rule and argued that in addition to integrating spiritualism with our personal lives, the government should also be generally there to support the welfare of individuals who don't have supports for themselves, right? What's interesting about all of this is it's not clear to me that there's any one right answer, right? And that every person at their point in history, you put it beautifully, right, was sort of responding to the problems that they saw. It's not as though we have this like pendulum swinging back and forth between freedom and independence or things like that, but it is something like that. These prominent voices are always to some degree reacting to the problems that they've seen. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that just like kind of quintessential to us as people? We like to think about the problems we have, and we really just talk about ways we might want to address those problems. Cool. Yeah, that's just a really cool thing to kind of dig through. So I want to take a short break here, and then we'll come back and talk about the United States and about how the United States system was developed with these kinds of thinkers in mind. We'll then dive a little bit more into Cowlitz County and some of the specific conversations relevant to that area. Cool. Any last thoughts there, Josh, before we take a break?
No, I've learned a lot today, so I appreciate what you've walked through thus far today.
Cool. All right, we'll take a break and come right back.
Awesome.
Okay, so let's jump back into it here and talk about the United States. I want to do a similar thing to what we just did, a little bit more brief, and talk about some of the like influential thinkers in the formation of the United States. Keeping in mind, right, um, up until Locke, so everybody that we just went through, up until Locke, these were all people that our framers would have had as influences in their thinking. There was a tremendous amount of writing done by a few of these people. One quick thing to point out, there's this Broadway play, Hamilton, that has been very popular for the last couple of years. I love it. I thought it was a great depiction of again the history that I know. One thing that they did not, I don't think they ever explicitly said this in the play or in the performance. They talked about the Federalist Papers. I don't know if they ever said the Federalist Papers, like, which is like, they talked about these letters that they wrote, and Hamilton wrote 51, but specifically there was this body of work called the Federalist Papers that James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton put together in defense of becoming a unified nation, right? So, man, I just find so much value in reading through their thinking and exploring the things that they thought about. I think that it would be worthwhile eventually to maybe do some review of those documents specifically, or the arguments that they made. But for now, I just want to do a very brief overview of these four people, of Thomas Jefferson, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. Josh, what is your frame of reference, if any, for these? Have you ever like done any study into these yourself? Has this ever been particularly interesting to you?
No. I mean, I don't want to say it hasn't been particularly interesting to me. I mean, like every American who's gone through our school system, right? Like I took the high school level government classes and the history classes. I would say Hamilton out of the. I mean, look, these four names are all familiar to me. I know exactly who they are and kind of, the major milestones that they had in American history. But I would say because of the Broadway play and all of that, Hamilton is probably like where my deepest knowledge is.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I would talk to me like I don't know a lot about individuals would be a fair statement.
That's fine. Yeah. So, all right. So let's talk first about Jefferson. Okay. Now, Jefferson's perspective on government was largely that the government gets its power from its people, and that it should principally be focused on protecting their rights. He held, similarly to, I think, Locke and to Mill, that the merits of a government the impact and intervention of a government should be very limited. It wasn't necessarily he was saying we don't need a federal system, but he was not as much of a defender of the Federalist perspective as the remaining three that we'll talk about next. Worthy contribution in this case, Thomas Jefferson was the original author of our Declaration of Independence. Now, he didn't like write it and just publish it immediately. He wrote like the first draft. One of the books I read, it's somewhere over there. One of the books I read in preparation for this was a book called The Fire of Liberty. And it at one point talks about Jefferson's general reluctance to author that Declaration of Independence. I believe it might have been Franklin who convinced him, like, no, you're actually the right guy to do this. But he was hesitant, right? And some of that flowery language at the beginning, the king's tyranny, was kind of funny to see sort of flow through. He took a very kind of hard stance against King George, and I think it's just interesting to think about Thomas Jefferson and his belief in limited government in the context of, rebelling against a monarchy. There was a whole lot in that book that was very interesting for me. For example, the First Amendment, right, the freedom of speech and peaceful assembly, was in part a reaction to restrictions that were placed on people in colonial America. one of the first things that the monarchy did was make it illegal for common people to meet if there was not a governor present, which was like an appointed official from the British monarchy. And so I just loved that, like, in those conversations, we actually had similar kinds of reactions to what we talked about earlier, right? Which is like,
Yeah.
hey, one of the things that's really important, don't make it illegal for us to meet in public, okay? You know. So Jefferson had this like flavor to him, right? Of this kind of rebellion against that monarchical power. And I think that's part of where his perspective on the limits of government would have sprung out from, right? How well does that align with what you know about Thomas Jefferson, Josh?
No, it aligns pretty much spot on with,
Cool.
with what I know.
So John Jay is next.
Yeah.
John Jay advocated for a constitutional framework, right? I think there was this argument at the time of how we would structure our government, and Jay argued that if we had a constitution, we could then base a lot of our decisions on that kind of founding document, right? Now, this is a little further on than the American Revolution, 1776 and thereabout. We started getting a little bit more into this conversation towards the time the Federalist Papers were written, right? 1787 and following. We'd had up to that point what was called the Articles of Confederation, which were sort of loose agreements across the different colonies for like how we should think and behave. And the Federalist Papers were in part arguing against the Articles of Confederation and in favor of a federal system on the basis of a constitution. John Jay was our first Chief Justice for the U.S. Supreme Court. So, he was an advocate for a judicial system that, based on that Constitution, made those kind of interpretive decisions. Decided, hey, how closely does this align with that kind of rule set that we created for ourselves at the very beginning? How consistent is it? And so he was not a very prominent author in the Federalist Papers. Obviously, Hamilton wrote many more, but John Jay was part of the discussion there and specifically focused on that judiciary, on the judges. Something just kind of clicked with me as I was talking. It kind of just occurred to me the role of a judge is to make judgment calls, right?
Right.
And if we're thinking about and basing our ideas on a constitution, we need somebody who is capable of interpreting that constitution. Those interpreters need to make judgments, right? And then that's kind of how we set that precedent, that future thinking. Well, here's the interpretation that we've taken. So next is Alexander Hamilton. For this slide, I did include Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Not, right? You kind of had to.
Well, and I think showing him side by side with Alexander Hamilton here, Hamilton was a very outspoken person. You read through the Federalist Papers and man, just like the language that this guy used was just incredible. I've taken it on myself, kind of a side project, to start kind of translating the Federalist Papers into modern speech because I feel there's so much value in the arguments that these guys made. But Hamilton, interestingly enough, I think I said this before, he argued against a Bill of Rights. He felt that really the job of the government was to kind of just maintain order, right? And to defend us against, tyranny, either from within or without. There are letters inside of the Federalist Papers that talk about the risks from the outside, right? Mm-hmm. And how us not being a strong, unified nation would pose risks to us in terms of people feeling they could come and attack us, take our resources. But he also felt that there was a tremendous amount of risk from internal forces to divide us and kind of split us apart. And so I think fundamentally Hamilton felt as though the best thing for us was to have a strong and structured federal government. And that if we had that kind of order, we would also then see naturally this support of the rights of the people and that protection against tyranny. His argument against the Bill of Rights, I think we talked about this just a little bit earlier, right? Yep. was largely that, like, hey, we kind of shouldn't go there. We shouldn't have, these open discussions about what is rights and what aren't, because if we do, we open up all kinds of discussions about, like, what counts. Pulling back to that thing he said earlier, right? We talk about freedom of the press. Okay, define freedom, define the press. Right? What does it mean to have free speech? These were his general concerns. Now, he spent most of his time, his most active contribution was in thinking about our economic system. He was very concerned with money, and so advocated for like the Federal Reserve. I think it was part of Hamilton's discussion, or at least maybe an outpouring of what he argued for. The banking system and the way that we managed our finances was very interesting to him. And again, if you think about it in terms of his idea that a strong and structured government was the best way to protect us from these very human problems, it makes sense that he would place some attention onto the money side of things, because, of course, if the money fails, if it doesn't work effectively, there's lots of other stuff that's going to fail as a result of that, right? A government that can't afford a military, that can't support its people, that can't ensure good infrastructure, was of deep concern. Any thoughts on that? I know, like you said, Hamilton is probably the one that you're most familiar with, so I'm curious if there's anything here.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's like I go back and forth, right? Because I think a Bill of Rights is a great thing, but at the same time, like, it just hits me, like, I get it. I get exactly where he's coming from on that viewpoint. And then it's like, even if you are able to use your example, define freedom and then define the press, like, that's Joe's definition, right? What about my definition? What about everybody else's definition? So it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think the idea was generally right. Like, this just opens up a conversation. It just opens up debate. I think that he felt we would be better off if we left those things up to active discussion at the time. But, of course, like, his voice was not the one we ended up listening to, right, in that particular regard. So, we'll talk next about Madison here.
Yep.
Now, Madison was a defender of this balance between different governmental bodies. He felt very strongly that we needed this push and pull between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, and that nobody should have too much power in themselves. That the centralization of power under a particular body, right, like a president or things like that, invited the same kinds of risks that we had seen in the past. And Madison had a huge hand in creating our Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, including those first 10 amendments, right? So what's really interesting is if we think about the way that the U.S. government system is designed, fundamentally, it's designed with a lot of these thoughts as part of it, right? And I'll pull back to something that Hamilton said in the very first Federalist paper. Again, there's this body of work that was talking about whether or not we should become a unified nation. Hamilton said something like this. The issue before us is incredibly important and is interesting to the entire world. Whether or not we can build a nation on the basis of logic and choice is of great interest to all of us, and if we fail, the consequences will be massive. That was the gravity of the discussion at the time. And so when we get into the U.S. Constitution, we get into the structures that were developed. This was the weight of that conversation. I can picture Hamilton, right, in those rooms. No, stop! What are you doing? You know what I mean?
Yeah, seriously.
But then, we ended up going with, as part of, with all that discussion in mind, we ended up moving to a constitutional system with those rights enumerated, right, listed out, and this balance of power associated with. So I want to move next to talk just a little bit about the different facets of the U.S. governmental system.
Yeah.
This is not going to be like a detailed, civics course, right? But just this is also interesting to kind of talk about. before I move into that, any other thoughts here on any of these guys?
No, I feel
Cool.
good.
All right, so the U.S. governmental system has like 5 facets, right? Yep. So, or at least this is kind of how I've chosen to organize it out. Obviously, we could talk for weeks on how all this works today, but we have a constitution, which is a legal framework, right? It defines the structures of government. We have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branches. And, we think about a constitution, this really, I think, lines up with like Locke and Mill, both talking about the government's role in defending the rights of the people, right? And the value of these structures associated with them. We have a federal system. So the idea of federalism here is that there is a division of authority and power going from large to small. We have the federal government, we have states, and we have smaller and smaller districts and counties and things like that with different kinds of legislative authority and power. We have a representative system. So we are not a direct democracy in the sense that individuals can come and say what they think, and that we go entirely based on that idea of the majority. And again, if we think back to arguments like John Stuart Mill's, right, his argument against the tyranny of the majority was also seen pretty heavily through the defense of the representative system. Madison argued for this, right? He talking about factions. He said the job of a representative is to try to see through all of that. It's to try to see through the majority perspective and to ensure that everybody that's subject to your rule is accounted for. Mm-hmm. Madison thought that a representative system was a way of ensuring that we didn't have one particular group creating all of our legislation, right? That if we don't have representatives, we run that risk of one group overrunning and subjugating another to its rule. And I think if you think about like even Rousseau and the arguments made there, I mean, it makes sense too where that risk might come from, right? Yeah. I think it's worth noting that like some of this language gets a little fuzzy, and there are people who've taken these ideas and kind of interpreted them a little bit differently, right? It'd be very easy for us to jump into concepts like cancel culture and stuff like that, and I don't really want to get into all of that today. But the idea in that representative system is that it would soften a little bit of that group idea, right? As a mechanism for protecting people who have conflicting ideas. Madison argued that representatives would at least be a little bit better at that. Not necessarily that representatives would solve the problem. Madison argued you really can't solve the problem of factions, but that you can try to control the effects of those factions, right? I'll stop there real quick, Josh. Any thoughts on like the representative system? I know there's lots of discussion and debate around this, like whether or not this is the right thing, and I'd just be curious to know if you have any opinion there.
No, I do, right? I think and without going too deep, right? Like I do generally think that it is a good and correct framework, but I think in my limited knowledge, right, I think there are ways that framework can get corrupted, and I think that there are ways that in that representative type of framework that we have today, it's very easy to separate from the common person, right? And I think that we talk about a lot of the problems that we're facing in, local areas, Cowlitz County, for example, but you can transpose that across the entire country, right? And I think that has been a big issue, right? Is how do we get back to what the common person needs? How do we get back from these super PAC fundings, right? And from the wealthy and the rich and the corporations.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that thread of I might call it corruption, right, is really important. Madison in that same letter also talked about the risks in a representative system, and of sizing of the space that representative had control over. He said, if it's too small, their focus is going to be too narrow. and it's going to be down to just what their community needs and not thinking about the big picture. And if their areas are too large, they're not going to think about those individual cases. They're not going to have time to dig into the weeds of things, right? So even he saw, I think, that there was going to be this like ebb and flow between, you know, I don't know that I really, in my own review of all this, I don't know that I really buy the argument that these guys didn't think of this, or, you know, couldn't have foreseen the ways that things are today. I think they did. I think they had a sense of where we were going. And the thing is, they kind of had the idea that we would spend our time thinking about these new problems and that we would change, right?
Yeah.
That we would like adjust when things got too bad. If anything, I feel like our system has progressed to a point where that kind of change and control over those things is so hard that we see these negative effects now, and we don't have a lot of ability to do anything about them.
Yep.
You know, and so it's not to say that the representative system is a even maybe the best system, depending on the context that you're in, right? But just to say that this was part of their thinking. You know, they were thinking about this stuff, talking about this stuff. Again, I picture Hamilton, you know, standing up on a chair, you know, stop, you idiots, like that kind of. The last two elements here of like the U.S. system, we have this defense of individual rights, right? Yep. And again, we're talking about like the Bill of Rights. We're talking about our constitutional framework and the interpretations thereof. And then lastly, we have our judicial review, right? Which is the judicial role of evaluating decisions made by legislatures, made by individuals against our constitutions. When I say constitutions, by the way, that might be surprising to some people. We have a U.S. Constitution. We also have state constitutions. Yep. You know, state of Washington has its own constitution that is supposed to be in line with our federal system, right? But kind of within the freedoms that the federal constitution provides, our individual way of doing things. I think that reflecting on all of this, right, this division of power and the attempts to kind of draw things down to individual groups is really, really important. And it's probably the structure that was most ardently defended in these conversations. Our ability to govern ourselves within the confines of this structured system, accounting for that big picture, but then within that, thinking about what we need, right? It's all through all of that discussion. It's all through all of that thinking.
Yeah.
Cool. I want to talk specifically about some issues that are relevant specifically to Cowlitz County. These are just sort of object discussions. I won't get too much into the weeds here, but Josh, I want to give you a sense of like some of what's going on. Before I do, any last thoughts or reflections on anything we've gone over so far today?
No. No, not right now, Joe.
Cool.
Again, I've been taking it in. I've been learning a lot today. So I appreciate you taking the time to walk me through.
Awesome. Okay, so let's just talk about Cowlitz County for a couple of minutes here. There's four things I wanted to briefly discuss. The first is a conversation about medical freedom. In Cowlitz County, we have a Board of Health, and that Board of Health is, in working alongside the Department of Health and Human Services here in Cowlitz County, specifically making decisions in the realm of health. The board is made up of, I believe they're made up of the county's medical officer and a number of representatives from the community. Pretty recently, in December of this last year, the Board of Health passed a resolution that, among other things, here's a couple of specific statements it made. The county shall not force individuals to accept medical intervention or to put something onto or into their body without informed consent. Public health emergencies will not be unilaterally imposed, and citizens have the right to make personal decisions about vaccines and masks. Now, this was similar to all of the things that we've talked about, right? Something of a reaction to broad statements made by the state of Washington about how we should be behaving in the wake of COVID.
Yeah.
The board was not like unanimous on this. I believe it was like 4-3 that this resolution would be passed, if memory serves me. But it was in response to these broad, like, hey, you need to shut down your business, you need to require masks, you need to require vaccinations. I think there is some merit, and I think we should be open to the idea that people would be frustrated by that and uncomfortable with the idea that a state agency would kind of come in over top of us and tell us how we're supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
This is not to say that I support this particular resolution. In my opinion, looking at the data that's provided there, I don't think it makes the case that they say that it makes. But this is just one, facet of this concept of freedom, is our ability to say, no, thank you. We don't really want that level of influence in our decisions, right?
Yeah.
The next is something called Initiative 1639. This is a rule passed, I believe, in 2023, which redefines a semi-automatic assault rifle to include a semi-automatic rifle. It also raises the age to purchase semi-automatic rifles from 18 to 21. It includes responsibilities on gun owners if their guns are not securely stored and are found out in the open or potentially used in the perpetration of a crime. And it also expands the background check requirements, including a waiver to waive your HIPAA rights in order to see your medical history, specifically for the purpose of like mental health evaluations. A lot of people in the state of Washington have reacted very strongly to these individual decisions, all kind of wrapped up under Initiative 1639, including our own sheriff, Brad Thurman, who, among others, has made statements saying that we will not enforce Initiative 1639. The defense that Sheriff Thurman gave in this case, and by the way, I have not talked to Sheriff Thurman, so I reserve my ability to give my uninformed opinion in this. But the defense from Sheriff Thurman is that this is currently being contested. And so while it's being contested, he does not feel maybe comfortable enforcing this particular set of laws. The state's response to that has been, hey, when we pass a law, that law is assumed constitutional until it's decided it's not constitutional anymore. And so, you can't make a case that just because somebody somewhere thinks that it's unconstitutional, that means that you're not going to enforce it. Again, we're having this discussion back and forth, right, about freedom and about whether or not it makes sense for somebody to do what is right in their own mind, right? I think specifically when we talk about law enforcement, there's a discussion about whether or not it is appropriate for law enforcement to pick and choose which laws they enforce, right? Again, I'm not here to give my individual opinion on this, but just to say again, this is part of that same discussion, right? The third case we have here is one called Gators Guns. Gators Guns is a gun shop here in Cowlitz County that sold a particular kind of magazine. And specifically, I think the wording of it was, it was like egregious and intentional violation of some of these laws. They had, from memory, 11,000 of these magazines that they were not supposed to be selling, and there were 5 cases in which they sold these magazines illegally to undercover agents who were trying to solicit those kind of purchases. So again, this is a discussion as well. Okay, what do you do in cases where there is a very clear violation of a law? And, how do you enforce that? In this case, the state attorney general is taking suit against Gators Guns and is saying, hey, you guys broke the law. This is a consumer protection issue. And they've done this in a lot of other areas, found that the vast majority of gun shops were complying with these laws. Gators Guns was not, right? So, again, there is a discussion. This time, rather than a law that a sheriff might not choose to enforce, we now have somebody who's broken a law that they feel they have the right to break. They feel this is restriction placed on them potentially inappropriately. So again, more discussion around the same, right?
Yeah.
The last one here is one that is a little closer. That I don't have a specific case for this one, but it's just an ongoing discussion happening right now in Cowlitz County about substance abuse. we have folks that are dealing with the pain of addiction and are dealing with the consequences of being addicted to a substance like heroin, or methamphetamines or fentanyl. That's another big one that is being talked about a little bit more in our area. And here I want to just briefly talk about um, the ability to place somebody in custody because we feel that they would be better off if they're not going to submit themselves to like a sobriety program, right? I have cases in my personal life of people who are making decisions that are really not in their own best interest, and I found myself very frustrated with the inability to um, act on their behalf when I know that they do not have the capacity to decide this for themselves. Um, but again, right? This is an open discussion about whether or not it's appropriate for us to restrict somebody's individual freedom, even in their own best interest, right? The law historically has erred on the side of reinforcing their individual rights and saying, you know what? Even though we feel like it would be the best thing for them if they were placed into a structured environment, if they were restricted more, we can't do that. Imagine the risk associated with taking away somebody's individual agency over their own lives. Especially in a case where we're like, but it's really better for you. It'd be really better for you if we did this. Yeah. Reflecting on that, right? Like there is a there's a tremendous risk in giving a government the ability to either stop someone from doing something they feel is right for them or to force them to do something they don't feel is right for them. Yep. And all these discussions, all these different thinkers, all these different ideas, I'm kind of drawing to a close here, right? Are dialogue about where the rights of an individual end and the responsibility of a government begins, right? Many people have made the argument that we're better off in a governmental system that allows us to act freely. We get into cases like mental health, we get into cases like substance abuse, it becomes a little less clear, right? Because what if they're acting freely, but what if they're acting in ways that we find, wrong, harmful to themselves, right? John Stuart Mill struggled with this. He again, he was a defender of this idea of being able to be eccentric. But he said, he also said that there is a limit to somebody's ability to harm themselves without also then causing harm to other people as a result, right? Even secondarily. Me causing harm to myself potentially puts responsibility on other people to deal with the fallout of that personal harm, right? So it just doesn't ever get simpler, right?
Never will.
Yeah. Kind of circling back to a thread that I feel like we've talked about before, the idea that there is one right answer to these problems, and that we would all be better off if we just did this thing this way. I hope that today it's been made clear that like actually there are potentially hundreds of different ways of thinking about this. Next time we'll talk about different forms of government and how those forms of government have tried to take into account all of these different constraints. I want to talk a little bit more directly about like individual benefit versus community benefit and freedom versus control. But for now, I hope this was useful for you. And did you have any final thoughts, Josh, or anything else we could fill in here?
No, it was incredibly useful for me. I like the way that you ended with substance abuse, mental health. I think it closes on just how complex these things are, and somebody who has witnessed that, right? Like I'm from a family of 6, and 50% of my direct family has struggled and still struggles with substance abuse and mental health. So like I know it, right? Like I want to take, to use your own words, I want to take their freedoms away. I want to do what I know would better them in the long run. But like same time, there's so many complexities and
Right.
so many dangerous outcomes that can start to happen from doing that, right? So,
Yeah.
um,
And it's
it's
fine, I think, in these individual situations to say, well, this is right for me, right? This is
Mhm.
right for my situation. And I recognize absolutely, right? Like, you should have, I think, the ability to think through your own circumstances and decide for yourself. Here's what the best thing is in my situation. I think there is a broader discussion happening though, on at what point you give a government the ability to make those same calls. And, because it does not end up just being about you as an individual. It ends up being, okay, well, what system might we support that allows for this kind of thing? And what are the risks associated with implementing a system that gives you that ability to infringe on another person's agency, right? Um, it's complicated, and frankly, I think that people try to make it a lot simpler than it is. They want to go all one way or the other. They want to go to complete freedom with no regulation, or they want to say, well, no, actually, we'd be better off if we just all followed the same set of rules. And I think one of the incredible things about what we have, right, this nation, um, is that it's a constant discussion. I know it's frustrating for people. I know it's really hard for them to recognize the merits of this debate and this discourse, because I agree to some extent that it's been very slow. I think that there are some changes that we'd probably already recognize the value in, and there are just some powers that prevent that from happening in exactly the way that we want it. But I think the debate is really important, right? To go back to Hamilton, whether or not we could build a nation on the basis of logic and choice is of great interest to the entire world, and if we fail, the consequences are dire. His opening statement to all this was, "What if it doesn't work? Right? What if we can't figure this out? What's next?" Because at that point, I think we'd seen a lot of the systems, and we have even better evidence now for the faults of those systems. So what do we do? you know.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Josh, for spending a little extra time with me today.